Just 48 hours ago, the world exhaled after weeks of rising tension, uncertainty, and fear as a ceasefire was finally announced between powerful forces that had pushed the Middle East to the edge of a much larger conflict. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stabilize. Markets surged, oil prices dropped, and a sense of relief spread across regions that had been holding their breath. It felt like the worst had been avoided, like the chaos might finally slow down, and for many people watching from a distance, it looked like peace was finally within reach. But that feeling didn't last long. Within hours of the announcement, something unexpected and deeply alarming happened. Airstrikes suddenly hit Lebanon with speed and intensity, shaking the fragile calm that had just begun to form. What was supposed to mark the beginning of de-escalation instead became the start of new confusion, raising serious questions about what the ceasefire actually meant and whether it was ever truly stable to begin with. To understand how everything began to fall apart so quickly, you have to look back, because this situation didn't start overnight. It has been building for years, with tensions gradually rising since 2023, when smaller clashes began turning into something much more dangerous. Each side responded to the other, and with every response came escalation, slowly transforming limited confrontations into a broader and more complex conflict. By 2024, the situation had intensified significantly, with airstrikes becoming more frequent and more aggressive, followed by ground operations in key areas that pushed the region further toward instability. Even during temporary pauses, the conflict never fully stopped. There was always pressure building in the background, like something waiting for the right moment to erupt again. Then in 2026, everything shifted dramatically as the conflict expanded beyond its original scope and began pulling in more powerful players, turning what was once seen as a localized issue into a regional crisis with global implications. The risks became far more serious, not just for the countries directly involved, but for the entire world. At the same time, the human cost continued to rise. Families were forced to leave their homes, entire communities faced uncertainty, and daily life became increasingly unpredictable for millions of people caught in the middle. Cities experienced ongoing disruption, essential services struggled to keep up, and fear became part of everyday life. But the real turning point came when the situation began to affect something much bigger: the global economy. A critical energy route, one that carries a significant portion of the world's oil supply, became uncertain, and that uncertainty sent shockwaves across international markets. Oil prices surged rapidly, investors reacted with concern, and world leaders began urgent discussions, recognizing that this was no longer just a regional issue but a global one. That pressure forced action. Behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts intensified as multiple countries stepped in to prevent further escalation. Communication channels were reopened, and among those involved, one country played a particularly important role in bridging the gap between opposing sides. Through careful negotiation and established trust, it helped create space for dialogue where direct communication had become difficult. Messages were exchanged, proposals were discussed, but reaching an agreement was not easy. Each side had its own demands and expectations. One pushed for a temporary pause in fighting, while the other aimed for something more permanent, something that would address the deeper issues behind the conflict. As time passed, the pressure continued to build. Deadlines approached, tensions rose, and the situation became increasingly fragile, with the risk of escalation growing more real by the hour. One wrong move could have changed everything. Then, at the last possible moment, something shifted. A breakthrough began to take shape, and a decision was made to pause the conflict. The ceasefire was announced, and the reaction was immediate. Relief spread quickly, markets surged again, and energy prices dropped sharply once more. For a brief moment, it felt like stability had returned, like the situation had been brought under control. But hidden within the agreement was a critical problem, something that had not been fully understood or clearly defined. On the surface, the ceasefire sounded simple: stop the fighting, reduce tensions, and move toward a longer-term solution. But behind the scenes, there was confusion. Not all sides interpreted the deal in the same way, and that difference created a dangerous gap. Some believed the agreement covered all fronts of the conflict, meaning that fighting would stop everywhere. Others saw it as limited, focused only on specific areas, leaving certain regions outside its scope. And right in the middle of that confusion was Lebanon, one of the most sensitive and volatile points in the entire situation. For some, Lebanon was included in the ceasefire. For others, it clearly was not. That difference in interpretation created a loophole, and within hours of the announcement, that loophole was tested: airstrikes. Resumed, fast and coordinated, hitting multiple locations in a short period of time. Panic spread quickly, people rushed through the streets, and emergency services struggled to respond. What was supposed to be a moment of calm turned back into chaos, and the timing made it even more shocking. This wasn't something that happened days later. It happened almost immediately after the ceasefire was announced. For civilians, the impact was deeply unsettling. One moment there was hope, the next there was fear again. Families who thought they were safe suddenly found themselves preparing for danger once more, and many were forced to move again as uncertainty returned. Emergency teams worked under pressure. Rescue efforts continued in difficult conditions, and the humanitarian situation worsened rapidly. Now everything is hanging by a thread. The ceasefire still exists, but trust is already breaking down, and the real question is no longer just about what happened, it's about what happens next. Was this agreement flawed from the beginning, or is this just the first crack in something that could still hold? Because whatever comes next will decide the direction of everything, and the next few moments could change it all. Now the situation enters its most dangerous phase, because what happens after a fragile ceasefire begins to crack is often more unpredictable than the conflict itself. The airstrikes that followed the announcement didn't just cause damage on the ground, they triggered a wave of reactions that quickly spread across the region. Statements were issued, warnings were delivered, and tensions that had briefly calmed started rising again. Each side began interpreting the situation in a way that justified its next move. And that is where the real danger begins, because when trust disappears, even the smallest action can be seen as a major provocation for Israel. The position appears clear. The broader ceasefire may exist, but certain threats still remain, and from its perspective, those threats cannot simply be ignored. The argument is built around security, around the idea that as long as hostile forces remain active in nearby areas, the risk never truly goes away. This creates a mindset where continuing operations is seen not as escalation, but as prevention. On the other side, however, that same action is viewed completely differently. For Iran and its allies, any continued strikes in Lebanon are seen as a direct violation of the spirit of the ceasefire, even if the wording of the agreement remains disputed. And this difference in interpretation is what turns a fragile pause into a potential collapse, because both sides believe they are acting within their rights, while also believing the other side is breaking the deal. That's how conflicts restart, through perception as much as action. As tensions rise, the risk of a chain reaction becomes very real. If one side escalates, the other responds. If that response is stronger, the cycle continues. And suddenly, what was supposed to be de-escalation becomes a new phase of confrontation. Already, signs of this pattern are beginning to appear. There are reports of renewed activity, warnings of further action, and increasing pressure from hardline voices on all sides who argue that backing down now would be seen as weakness. And in situations like this, internal pressure can be just as powerful as external threats. Leaders are not only managing international negotiations, they are also facing expectations from within their own countries, from supporters who demand strength, and from critics who question every decision. This makes compromise much harder, because every move is being watched, judged, and interpreted in multiple ways. At the same time, diplomatic efforts have not stopped. In fact, they have intensified behind closed doors. Negotiations are continuing, with teams working to clarify the terms of the ceasefire and prevent further escalation. Meetings are taking place, messages are being exchanged, and attempts are being made to close the gaps in understanding that led to this situation in the first place. But the challenge is enormous, because the issue is no longer just about stopping attacks, it's about rebuilding trust. And that is much harder to achieve once it has been broken. One of the key problems is that the ceasefire itself may have been rushed under pressure. With global markets reacting and the risk of wider instability increasing, there was a strong incentive to reach an agreement quickly. And while that urgency may have helped stop immediate escalation, it also meant that some details were not fully aligned. Now those gaps are becoming visible, and they are creating space for conflict to return. Another major factor is the role of alliances. No country in this situation is acting alone. Every decision is influenced by relationships, by strategic interests, and by long-term goals that go beyond the current crisis. This adds another layer of complexity, because any agreement has to balance multiple priorities at once. And when those priorities don't align perfectly, Tensions can resurface even after a deal is announced. The situation on the ground adds even more pressure. Civilians continue to face uncertainty, with many unsure whether the ceasefire will hold or collapse completely. Humanitarian concerns are growing. As displacement increases and resources are stretched thin, every new development affects real lives, and that reality makes the stakes even higher. Because while leaders negotiate and strategies are debated, people on the ground are dealing with the immediate consequences. And that creates urgency, because the longer uncertainty continues, the greater the impact becomes. At the same time, the global dimension of this crisis cannot be ignored. Energy markets remain sensitive, investors are watching closely, and governments around the world are preparing for multiple scenarios. If the ceasefire holds, stability could return gradually. But if it collapses, the consequences could spread far beyond the region, affecting economies, supply chains, and international relations on a much larger scale. That's why so much attention is focused on what happens next, because this is not just a regional issue, it's a global one. The next phase will likely be defined by a series of critical decisions. Will the parties involved agree on a unified interpretation of the ceasefire, or will the differences continue to grow? Will diplomatic efforts succeed in restoring trust, or will further actions push the situation back into open conflict? And perhaps most importantly, will there be enough political will on all sides to prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage? These are the questions that will shape the outcome, and right now there are no clear answers. What is clear, however, is that the situation remains extremely fragile. The ceasefire is still in place, but it is under pressure. Every new development has the potential to either stabilize or destabilize the situation further, and in moments like this, small actions can have large consequences. A single decision, a single response can shift the entire direction of events. That is why the coming days are so critical, because they will determine whether this fragile pause can be transformed into something more lasting, or whether it will break apart completely. As the world watches, one thing becomes increasingly certain. This is not just about what has already happened, but about what happens next. The story is still unfolding, and the outcome is still uncertain. But one way or another, the decisions made in this moment will shape the future of the region, and possibly far beyond it. So the question now is simple, but incredibly important. Does this ceasefire survive the pressure it is facing, or is this just the beginning of something much bigger? Because whatever happens next will define everything. Now everything comes down to what happens next, because the situation is no longer just about a ceasefire, it's about whether that ceasefire can actually survive the pressure being placed on it from every direction. Diplomatic teams are still working behind the scenes, trying to bring clarity to an agreement that was accepted quickly, but not fully aligned. Conversations are ongoing, proposals are being adjusted, and efforts are being made to prevent further escalation before it reaches a point where it can no longer be controlled. But the challenge is becoming more difficult with each passing hour, because the longer confusion continues, the harder it becomes to rebuild trust between the sides involved. Every new strike, every new statement, and every new reaction adds another layer of tension, making it more difficult to return to a stable position. At the same time, pressure is building not just internationally, but internally as well. Leaders are facing expectations from their own people, from political groups, and from institutions that demand strong responses rather than compromise. And that creates a situation where, even if there is a path to de-escalation, choosing that path may come at a political cost. This is where many agreements fail, not because solutions don't exist, but because the cost of accepting them becomes too high. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation continues to worsen. Civilians remain caught in uncertainty, unsure whether to trust the ceasefire or prepare for further escalation. Displacement continues, resources are stretched, and the longer this instability lasts, the more difficult recovery will become. This adds urgency to the situation, because time is not neutral, it is actively making the problem worse. On a global level, the stakes remain just as high. Energy markets are still sensitive, governments are closely monitoring developments, and the possibility of wider economic impact remains very real. A stable outcome could bring relief and gradual recovery, but a collapse could trigger another wave of instability that spreads far beyond the region. This is why so much attention is focused on the next phase of negotiations, because those discussions will likely determine whether this moment becomes a turning point toward stability or a step toward further conflict. There are several possible paths forward, and each one carries its own risks. One path is that all sides reach a clearer understanding of the ceasefire terms, agree to limit further actions, and begin building toward a more comprehensive agreement. This would require compromise, patience, and a willingness to step back from immediate gains in favor of long-term stability. Another path is that misunderstandings continue. Actions are taken based on conflicting interpretations, and the ceasefire gradually weakens until it collapses completely. In that scenario, escalation becomes much more likely, and the region could return to a cycle of conflict that is even harder to control. There is also a third possibility, one where the ceasefire technically remains in place, but violations continue in limited ways, creating a prolonged state of instability where peace exists only on paper. That kind of situation can be just as dangerous because it creates constant uncertainty and leaves the door open for sudden escalation at any moment. Right now, it is not clear which path will be taken, and that uncertainty is what makes this moment so critical. The decisions being made are not just about immediate actions, but about setting the direction for what comes next. And in situations like this, direction matters more than speed, because once a path is chosen, it becomes much harder to change course later. The world is watching closely, not just for what is being said, but for what is actually being done. Actions will matter more than words in the coming days, and those actions will reveal whether there is a real commitment to de-escalation or whether the ceasefire was only a temporary pause in a much larger conflict. For now, everything remains uncertain. The ceasefire exists, but it is under strain. Negotiations are happening, but they are fragile, and the outcome is still undecided. What is certain, however, is that this moment will shape what comes next, and the impact of these decisions will be felt far beyond the immediate region. This is not just another headline, it is a turning point, and the direction it takes will define the future in ways that are difficult to predict right now. And here's the part most people are missing. The next 48 hours could decide everything. Will this ceasefire hold and turn into something bigger, or collapse and pull the region back into conflict? We're tracking every update as it happens, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because the next development might completely change the story. Drop your thoughts below. Do you think this deal survives? Or is this just the beginning of something much bigger? I'll see you in the next update.